At 9:42 Moscow time, November 17, 1983, a translator in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs made a note in the margin of an English-language communiqué that would, 6 months later, collapse an entire network of foreign intelligence inside the Kremlin. Her name, later confirmed as Irina Pavlovna Morozova, born 1949, graduate of the Moscow State Linguistic University, fluent in English, French, and German, was printed on the bottom corner of the memo in blue ink, her handwriting neat, bureaucratic, and without personality. But the note she wrote in the margin was not bureaucratic. It read simply, "The phrase Mutual Agricultural Assistance Clause does not exist in the original Soviet draft." That was all. 11 words. But those 11 words triggered a chain of verifications, meetings, denials, and surveillance orders that would eventually uncover the single most damaging CIA infiltration of the Soviet Foreign Ministry since 1962. Irina noticed the anomaly during her third consecutive day of cross-verifying diplomatic documents between Moscow and Washington. Her job was precise but unremarkable: to compare translated copies of official correspondence before they were archived. The workroom on the 4th floor of the ministry building on Smolenskaya Square smelled of typewriter oil and stale coffee. Its windows were sealed shut for the winter, and every sound, the clack of keys, the whisper of carbon paper, the hum of fluorescent lights, seemed muted, as if absorbed by the thick beige walls that had seen 1,000 secrets pass through them. She had already compared 15 pages that morning without issue. Each sentence matched the previous drafts. Nothing unusual until she reached the section discussing food supply coordination during agricultural shortages. In the English version, sent from Washington, there was a paragraph referencing a clause of mutual agricultural assistance. The Soviet original contained no such line. There was no clause. It did not exist. At first, she assumed it was a clerical error. Perhaps an earlier draft had included the sentence, and it had been removed. But when she cross-checked the record log, she found no trace of it. The addition had appeared only in the final English version, inserted somewhere between the translator's desk and the encrypted cable to the U.S. State Department. Such things were not supposed to happen. Every line of a diplomatic translation passed through at least 3 levels of clearance: linguistic verification, departmental review, and security screening by the Committee for State Security, KGB Directorate S. No one could add a clause unnoticed. No one, unless they knew exactly how the ministry's communication system functioned. Irina's pencil hovered over the margin for a moment before she made the note. She did not know why her pulse had begun to quicken. The phrase itself was harmless, but the placement, the rhythm of the sentence, felt off. It did not read like bureaucratic language, it read like a signal. The memorandum was scheduled to be filed that afternoon, but Irina's note delayed the process. Her supervisor, Deputy Director Sergei Petrovich Voronin, reviewed it briefly and ordered a discreet verification through the translation registry. By 14 hours, the registry reported that the original translator of the English draft, one senior linguist Ivan Grigorovich Taranov, had been on leave that week. The file had been finalized by another employee acting under authorization. The authorization itself, however, bore Voronin's signature. Voronin denied signing it. At 15:47 hours, an internal alert was transmitted to the KGB's Second Chief Directorate, responsible for counterintelligence within the USSR. A routine linguistic discrepancy had become a potential breach. Within 24 hours, Irina's note had been photocopied, classified as sensitive, and forwarded to Department K, Counterespionage for State Institutions. A quiet investigation began, quiet enough that even Irina was unaware it existed. For the next several days, ministry documents underwent silent re-examination. Investigators discovered 3 other communiques containing similarly invisible insertions, phrases, or clauses, added in translation, subtle enough to escape detection. Each appeared to reference agricultural or humanitarian coordination, harmless subjects. Yet, when analyzed together, they formed a pattern. The first letters of certain inserted terms, when rearranged, spelled the sequence AGL 1, 3. That meant nothing to the linguists. But to the KGB's encryption analysts, it meant everything. AGL 1-3 was a CIA internal designation for a covert communication channel used by assets operating inside Soviet institutions. The realization hit the directorate like a slow-moving avalanche. Somewhere inside the Foreign Ministry, a mole was embedding coded signals into official translations messages that passed invisibly through diplomatic exchanges, riding on the language itself. Irina Morozova had not discovered a clerical error. She had stumbled onto an American communication route hidden in plain sight. The first thing the KGB did was isolate her. Without explanation, she was reassigned to a different office, temporary reallocation for translation efficiency, according to the paperwork. 2 officers in plain suits escorted her to the new workspace, a smaller room without a window. They removed her previous files, her typewriter, even her carbon ribbons. For 3 days, no one spoke to her except to deliver fresh pages to translate. She realized then that her note, those 11 words, had started something far larger than she could imagine. On the 4th day, she received a visitor, a man with gray hair and eyes that never blinked long enough to seem human. He introduced himself as Colonel Viktor Andreevich Zorin, Committee for State Security. His voice was calm, low, and polite, too polite. He asked her to recount, in exact detail, what she had seen in the document. When she finished, he closed his notebook and said quietly, "Comrade Morozova, the party thanks you. But from this point forward, you are not to discuss what you found, not with colleagues, not with family. You will continue your work as if nothing occurred." Then he left, leaving only the faint smell of tobacco and the weight of an unspoken truth behind him. Outside, snow had begun to fall over Moscow. In the distance, the bells of the Foreign Ministry tower rang 6 times. Inside the sealed office, Irina looked down at her typewriter ribbon, black, narrow, precise, and thought of the sentence that had started it all. 11 words, a phrase that never existed. And now, because of it, the Kremlin was holding its breath. The Moscow of 1983 did not sleep. It waited. Even in November, when snow turned the avenues into corridors of white silence, the city pulsed faintly beneath electric lights, reflected in frozen puddles, distant engines of night buses, and the dull heartbeat of a state that watched everything. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs towered above Smolenskaya Square like a frozen cathedral, its Gothic spires cutting through the fog. To most citizens, it was a monument to bureaucracy. To those who worked inside, it was a living organism of whispers, papers, and suspicion. Within its corridors, words were more dangerous than weapons. Every document was a loaded gun. Every sentence could trigger a crisis if translated incorrectly. Irina Pavlovna Morozova understood this better than anyone. She had spent 12 years inside those walls, moving between the translation department and the documentation archive. Her work left no fingerprints, no trace of self. That was the mark of a good translator in the Soviet system: invisibility, to serve language without ever being seen by it. Her colleagues described her as quiet, precise, and without excess emotion. She did not drink, did not gossip, and did not smile unless protocol required it. She was unmarried, lived alone in a one-room apartment on Bolshaya Nikitskaya Street, and owned exactly 2 personal luxuries: a German-made fountain pen and a small transistor radio. She kept tuned to the Foreign Service broadcasts, the BBC, Voice of America, Deutsche Welle, purely, as she told herself, for linguistic training. She began her career in 1971, when the Cold War's frost had thickened after the Prague Spring. At the university, she was known for her unnerving ability to recall entire paragraphs after a single reading. Professors noted her almost mechanical focus, the way she could transcribe speeches without a single missed syllable. In a country where information was currency, memory like hers was power. The KGB noticed her early. A man in a dark overcoat attended her final thesis defense. He never introduced himself, never asked questions, but afterward, her supervisor mentioned an opportunity with the ministry. It wasn't a request. Within a month, she had been vetted, cleared, and placed in the department responsible for translating incoming foreign correspondence letters, agreements, and communiques that passed daily between Moscow and its embassies. Her task was to make sure the words said what Moscow wanted them to say. She believed, at first, in the precision of that mission. But 12 years inside the ministry changed that belief. Precision became paranoia. Every day, Irina watched colleagues disappear without announcement. Desks emptied overnight, files reclassified and sealed. Once, in 1977, she arrived to find the entire Section 4 staff reassigned to provincial linguistic duties. No explanation. 2 months later, one of them was found dead in what the newspapers called an unfortunate automobile collision. Everyone understood. No one said a word. By 1983, Irina spoke less and smoked more. Her movements were routine. Tram to Smolenskaya, work from 9 to 18, return home, tea, one radio broadcast, then sleep. Her existence was a straight line, and like all straight lines in the Soviet Union, it was one decision away from ending abruptly. The man who had recruited her, Colonel Viktor Andreevich Zorin, had not aged well. He was a fixture in the ministry's shadow operations, a liaison between the KGB's second chief directorate and the foreign ministry. His face appeared in no photographs, but his name surfaced in countless reports. Those who worked with him said he never raised his voice, never smiled, and never forgot anything said in his presence. Zorin's office, located in the sub-basement of the ministry building, was devoid of warmth. A single bulb, a steel desk, a phone line connected directly to Lubyanka. On the wall behind him hung 2 items, a faded portrait of Dzerzhinsky and a map of the United States marked with thin red pins. When Irina's report crossed his desk, he already knew her history, her habits, her apartment layout, and the exact hour she left home each morning. He had read her personnel file like scripture. She was ideal, disciplined, apolitical, quiet, the perfect witness for an event she didn't yet understand. Outside the walls of the ministry, Moscow was a different city. Queue lines wrapped around grocery stores, shelves were half empty. People spoke softly on trams, careful not to draw attention. The Afghan war had drained the country's optimism, and rumors of American missiles in Western Europe kept the air tense. On the streets, loudspeakers still broadcast party slogans about peace and solidarity. Inside apartments, the sound of typewriters was often muffled by blankets, samizdat copies of banned novels, or letters written to relatives abroad. Irina lived among these contradictions. Her building, like most of the era, was a Khrushchevka, 5 stories of grey concrete, thin walls, and leaking pipes. Her neighbor across the hall, an elderly widow, spent nights tapping on the radiator pipes to communicate with friends 2 floors below. The sound was rhythmic, almost musical, and sometimes Irina would pause her translation work just to listen, pretending the coded taps were part of some invisible conversation she could never join. At work, everything was measured. Security officers circulated through the corridors with the quiet authority of ghosts. Every translator's desk had a locked drawer for classified documents. The keys were numbered and logged daily. Telephones were monitored. Elevators recorded floor access. Even the typewriter ribbons were collected and burned weekly in the incinerator room. And yet, despite this architecture of control, someone inside the ministry had been slipping coded language into diplomatic texts for nearly 5 years. The technique was ingenious. No microfilm, no couriers, no intercepted phone calls, just words, minor insertions that meant nothing to ordinary readers, but everything to those trained to interpret them. It was linguistic smuggling, the perfect crime for a world built on translation. Irina's discovery came at a time when paranoia inside the ministry was already near breaking point. 2 months earlier, a senior trade attaché in Bonn had defected, bringing with him hundreds of documents detailing Soviet procurement methods. The embarrassment had reached the Politburo. A directive was issued to tighten internal control of language services, an ironic measure given that the enemy now hid inside the language itself. Colonel Zorin formed a small investigative cell under Department K. Its purpose: trace every suspect translation back to its source. 4 officers, all from different divisions, worked in silence behind locked doors. Irina's name appeared on their whiteboard, not as a suspect, but as a vector, the point where the thread began. Zorin's method was slow, methodical. He ordered linguistic audits of every document Irina had handled in the past 6 months. Each one was examined for irregularities in syntax, unusual idioms, or English phrasing inconsistent with Soviet templates. The analysts found patterns too subtle for machines to detect, certain adjectives repeating in non-standard combinations, verbs placed one position off from the model text. When these fragments were aligned sequentially, they formed coordinates that pointed not to a location, but to a date, December 9th, 1983. The investigators didn't yet understand what was planned for that day. They only knew the messages were converging toward it. Zorin ordered surveillance on 5 ministry employees connected to the translation chain. Phones were tapped, apartments were entered, letters opened and photographed. Irina's name remained on a separate list, asset, unwitting. She was useful precisely because she didn't know she was being used. On December 2nd, she received a transfer order, placing her temporarily on night shift verification. The memo was signed by Zorin himself. The night shift was a strange world. The ministry after hours was silent, except for the low hum of heating ducts. Only the lights in the translation wing stayed on. Most nights, Irina worked alone. A guard checked her ID at midnight and again at 3 a.m. Outside, snow coated the streets in a layer of sterile white, reflecting the glow of the ministry's floodlights. Her new assignments were different. They weren't diplomatic communiques anymore, but internal memos, most already translated. Her task was to review terminology consistency. In reality, she was bait. The investigators knew the mole would attempt another insertion before the supposed event on December 9th. They needed someone to notice it naturally, without prompting. Irina was that someone. She did not know the room had microphones. She did not know the typewriter ribbon on her desk was replaced daily and examined by KGB technicians. She only knew that her work had become heavier, stranger. Sentences carried hidden rhythms she couldn't name. Phrases like adjustment of harvest quotas or supplementary aid clause began to feel wrong, as if the words themselves were watching her. One night, after hours of staring at the same paragraph, she whispered quietly in English, "This isn't translation anymore. This is a cipher." Her voice was caught on tape. The next morning, the phrase was underlined in a transcript on Colonel Zorin's desk. He smiled, the closest thing he had to one. The trap was working. Outside, Moscow's winter deepened. News bulletins spoke of frost, shortages, power cuts in the provinces. Inside the ministry, the temperature never changed. Constant, artificial warmth humming from radiators. Irina's eyes ached from the strain of the green desk lamp. Her hands trembled when she smoked. Each night, she caught glimpses of movement in the corridor, shadows that passed her office window and didn't return. She began to dream of language collapsing, letters falling off pages, sentences losing structure, words turning to ash. The following week, Colonel Zorin received a secure cable from Lubyanka. Proceed. Surveillance stage concluded. Authorization granted for Phase 2. Phase 2 meant Bait would become witness. On December 8th, Irina was assigned to verify a routine communiqué between the Soviet embassy in Ankara and the Central Committee. It was stamped urgent and sealed with the usual red wax. As she unrolled the document, she noticed the familiar phrasing. Again, agricultural cooperation, mutual supply clause, the same code. Only this time, she saw something new. A comma, slightly misplaced, a typographical pattern repeating every fifth word. She frowned, counted, then counted again. The fifth word spelled, tomorrow, basement archive, 2340. She set down her pencil. Her reflection in the typewriter glass looked older, colder. Somewhere deep in the ministry, another hand was writing the same code. Someone she probably knew, someone who would soon realize she'd seen it. Outside, a blizzard began to swallow the city. Inside, the trap was ready to close. The following reconstruction is based on surveillance records, linguistic forensics, and testimonies collected between December 1983 and April 1984. Chronology verified by Department K. Status: confirmed internal breach. The night of December 8, 1983 began like any other inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Predictable, silent, controlled. Irina Pavlovna Morozova arrived at 22:15, presented her identification card to the guard, signed the attendance register, and proceeded to the fourth-floor translation wing. The corridors were deserted except for a janitor mopping the marble floor, his movements slow and indifferent. Outside, snow fell in heavy, soundless sheets, covering the windows until even the floodlights disappeared. Inside, only the green glow of Irina's desk lamp broke the darkness. At 22:40, she began reviewing the Ankara communiqué again. She circled the phrase, mutual agricultural assistance, underlined the misplaced comma, and wrote in the margin, check source copy. Then she stopped. A faint metallic click echoed from somewhere behind her, the air vent above the radiator. She froze, listening. The sound came again, a soft, deliberate scrape of metal against metal, followed by the muffled thud of something falling inside the vent. When she stood on the chair to look, the light from her lamp caught a small object lodged between the slats, a folded slip of paper, yellowed and creased, the kind used in internal routing envelopes. She hesitated, then pulled it free. The handwriting was not hers, not anyone's from her section. Block capitals in English, Eagle 1-3, extraction delayed. Confirm if contact neutralized, await signal via standard clause. Irina read it twice before realizing she was shaking. She slipped the paper into her sleeve, sat down, and stared at the typewriter before her. Somewhere inside this building, someone had been using her translations as a signal chain. Someone had access to her office, her desk, her hours. The last line of the note standard clause meant one thing: the phrase, mutual agricultural assistance. The phrase she had questioned 3 weeks earlier. By 23:10, she had stopped pretending to work. Her thoughts circled one possibility. Whoever had placed the note in her vent believed she was part of the network. And at 23:40, according to the coded message, something would happen in the basement archive. She looked at the clock. 23:17, 23:24. Security cameras recorded Irina leaving her office, carrying her translation file and a half-empty cigarette pack. 23:29. She entered the central stairwell and descended 2 flights. The corridors below were lit only by red emergency bulbs. Her heels made no sound on the rubber flooring. 23:37. She reached the basement level. The archive doors stood unguarded, locked only by a mechanical latch. Beyond them stretched a series of concrete corridors, lined with metal shelving, filled with thousands of folders, that smelled of dust and iron oxide. Somewhere far inside, a pipe dripped water at regular intervals, a slow, rhythmic sound that merged with her heartbeat. At 23:40 precisely, a second set of footsteps echoed from the corridor behind her. Irina turned. A man approached, holding a briefcase. He was middle-aged, short, balding, slightly familiar. His name surfaced in her memory like a photograph emerging in a chemical bath. Deputy Director Sergei Petrovich Voronin. Her former supervisor, the one who had signed the forged authorization weeks earlier. He looked at her without surprise, as though her presence had been expected. "Morozova," he said quietly, "I was told you might come." His tone was calm, paternal almost. He opened the briefcase and withdrew a thin stack of files bound with twine. "I need you to finalize these translations before morning. Sensitive material." She didn't move. "You shouldn't be here at this hour, Comrade Director." "Then, would tried at 14 Trust." He smiled faintly. "Neither should you." Then he set the files on the table and took a step closer. "What did you find, Irina?" The question landed like a blade. Not if she found something what he knew or suspected. Irina's mouth was dry. She wanted to speak, to ask who he was working for, but years of bureaucratic discipline held her still. She met his eyes instead. They were pale, gray, expressionless, the kind of eyes that had seen too much to fear anything. Voronin lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. "You're intelligent. You must realize the machine we serve is broken. Half the files you translate go nowhere. Half the people you report to don't exist. Moscow writes letters to itself to prove it's still breathing." He leaned closer. "But there are others who still listen. In Washington, in Vienna, even in Geneva, they understand the language of reason. They want peace." "Peace," she repeated, her voice mechanical. He smiled again, almost sadly. "That word still frightens you, doesn't it?" From somewhere above, a distant elevator clanged open. Voronin stubbed out his cigarette. "Tell them I was here," he said. "Tell your new friends at Lubyanka that I offered you a choice." Then he turned and walked down the corridor, his footsteps fading into the dark. At 03, a surveillance unit under Colonel Zorin entered the basement. Their orders were to observe only, but the cameras recorded more than observation. They found Irina standing alone, staring at the vent note in her hand. When questioned, she could only whisper, "He knew my name." The next morning, Voronin's apartment was found empty. His identification documents were gone. The same day, a coded transmission was intercepted by the Technical Directorate, a burst signal sent from a diplomatic frequency used by the U.S. Embassy. The message, when decrypted, contained only 3 words: "Echo terminated. Retrieve." The mole had vanished. For the next 2 months, Moscow lived under a silence that felt radioactive. Zorin's investigation expanded to 47 ministry employees. 10 were detained, 6 dismissed, 3 reassigned to remote postings in Irkutsk. Files were confiscated, telephones replaced, entire translation archives retyped from scratch. Irina remained at her desk. She was never formally questioned again, but she understood. She was no longer a translator. She was a witness, held in plain sight. Every morning, a new file appeared on her desk, each marked for linguistic verification. Each one bore traces of the same coded structure, tiny, deliberate errors. But now, she recognized them instantly, like the face of an old enemy. Sometimes, late at night, she imagined she could hear the language itself whispering back, trying to repair what had been broken. In February 1984, an unmarked envelope arrived at her apartment. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a single page of typed text, English, machine-written. "They will erase him from the archives. But history forgets, slowly." A friend in silence. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco, the same brand Voronin had smoked. Irina burned it in the sink, watched the flame curl the letters into ash, and turned on the faucet until the smoke disappeared. That same week, Colonel Zorin submitted his final report to the committee. The breach, codenamed Project Echo, utilized a covert linguistic cipher embedded in ministerial translation files. The operative, identified as Deputy Director S.P. Voronin, exploited his clearance to alter outgoing communications. His methods were linguistically sophisticated, undetectable to automated screening. Objective: transmit operational cues to CIA Station Moscow under the pretext of routine diplomatic correspondence. The cipher was discovered incidentally by translator I.P. Morozova. Her observation initiated the chain leading to detection. Subject classified as non-complicit. Recommendation: containment through reassignment. 3 weeks later, Irina received another transfer notice. This time, not to another department, but to another city. Leningrad Technical Translation Bureau. No. 6. No explanation. No farewell. Her clearance was reduced, her salary adjusted, and her personal file sealed. Before leaving Moscow, she was summoned once more to Lubyanka for a final interview. The interrogation room was cold, lit by a single overhead lamp. Colonel Zorin sat behind the table, a file folder before him. He looked older, more human now, though his voice remained even. "You did well," he said, "but you must understand this was never about one man. It was about a method. Words as code. The Americans will try again." She nodded. Zorin closed the folder. "Do you believe in coincidence, Comrade Morozova?" "No." "Good," he said softly. "Neither do we." He stood, extended his hand, a gesture both polite and final. "You may go. The train leaves at 23. Do not be late." That night, she left Moscow carrying a single suitcase, a handful of documents, and the knowledge that she had seen the language of her country turned into a weapon. Leningrad was quieter. She worked in an office overlooking the frozen Neva, translating technical manuals for factory machinery. No more diplomatic cables, no more encryption audits. But sometimes, when she read a line of English text, she still searched unconsciously for hidden meaning, commas out of place, phrases that didn't belong. Once, in early spring, she came across a sentence in a British engineering manual that made her stop cold. "All systems require calibration after mutual assistance protocols, Morse C." Her pen trembled, but she said nothing. She underlined the phrase once, neatly, as she had done that first day in Moscow, and moved on to the next line. Meanwhile, in the archives of the KGB, Project Echo was marked closed. Voronin's photograph was removed from ministry records. His personnel number was reassigned. Officially, he had never existed. But inside the cipher analysis department, his method became a case study. Officers learned how to hide meaning inside bureaucratic syntax, how to use language itself as camouflage. The irony was complete. The Soviet state, which had hunted the code, now adopted it. And somewhere in Leningrad, Irina continued to translate line after line until the words no longer meant anything at all. Excerpt from Debrief Memorandum, Department K, 1985. Subject remains loyal, displays symptoms of linguistic fatigue and disassociation, typical among high-stress translators. No further surveillance required unless contact re-established. Language is the cleanest weapon. It kills slowly, invisibly, and leaves the corpse still speaking. Extract from Internal Memorandum, Directorate S, 1984, March 1984, Leningrad. 3 months after her transfer, Irina Pavlovna Morozova received a call from a number she did not recognize. The voice on the line was quiet, male, official. "Comrade Morozova, this is Captain Lebedev, Ministry of Internal Affairs. We require your assistance in an ongoing verification audit. You will receive a rail ticket by courier within the hour. You are to report to Building 8, Fontanka Embankment, Room 312, at 9 tomorrow. Bring your identification papers." Then, the line went dead. She sat in silence, long after the dial tone faded, staring at the chipped enamel teacup in her hand. The voice had not said why. By now, she knew better than to ask. The building on the Fontanka was old Tsarist stone, repurposed for ministry use after the war. Its corridors smelled of dust and disinfectant. Room 312 contained a table, 2 chairs, and a wall clock that ticked too loudly. A man in a dark wool uniform waited behind the table. He was not Captain Lebedev. He was Colonel Viktor Zorin, older, thinner, still immaculate. He motioned for her to sit. "I trust your work in Leningrad has been uneventful," he said. "Yes, Comrade Colonel." "Good. We prefer it that way." He opened a folder, its contents hidden beneath a red cover sheet, stamped Restricted Access, Level 3. For a moment he said nothing, just watched her. Then, in a tone that was almost conversational, he asked, "Tell me, Comrade Morozova, do you believe you caught a spy?" She hesitated. "I believe I exposed one." Zorin's eyes lifted from the folder. "Exposed," he repeated softly, as if testing the word. "No, comrade, you revealed exactly what you were meant to reveal. Invested fours." Her breath caught. "I don't understand." He closed the folder with deliberate care. "You will." The truth, as the colonel laid it out, came slowly, measured like a confession written by someone else. Voronin, the so-called traitor, the man who had vanished, had not been a CIA mole at all. He had been KGB director at S, subsection Mirror, a counterintelligence decoy program created in 1978 to identify foreign collection methods inside Soviet ministries. For 5 years, Voronin's task had been to impersonate a double agent, feeding harmless but convincing fragments through fabricated channels, the agricultural clause cipher among them, in order to lure real Western handlers into the open. His handlers, in turn, believed him genuine. Small pieces of information were traded to maintain credibility. The goal was simple: draw out American collection assets operating under diplomatic cover in Moscow. But somewhere along the chain, the operation fractured. Signals were misinterpreted. Code words crossed departments. The deception, meant to trap the enemy, had turned inward. By the time Irina noticed the Mutual Agricultural Assistance Clause, the KGB itself no longer remembered which parts of the cipher were fiction and which were live. Voronin's last transmission, Echo Terminated, Retrieve, was not an escape message to Langley. It was a recall order from Lubyanka. He had been terminated, yes, but not by the Americans, by his own side. Irina listened without moving, her eyes fixed on the scarred tabletop. Outside, traffic hissed over wet snow. The clock on the wall ticked mercilessly. Finally, she said, "You used me." Zorin nodded once. "We used your competence. It was the only element still incorruptible." Her throat tightened. "You let me think I'd uncovered an American network." "You did uncover a network," he said evenly. "It simply belonged to us." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Understand, Comrade Morozova, you were chosen precisely because you are clean. If the discovery had come from within Department K, suspicion would have turned outward. But when it comes from a civilian translator, it looks authentic." He allowed the silence to stretch. "You gave our fabrication the credibility it required." Irina whispered, "He died for that credibility." Zorin's expression didn't change. "He died serving the same purpose as you, to preserve the integrity of the state's illusions." He rose, paced slowly behind her chair. "Do you know what happens when an institution forgets which lies are its own?" he asked. "It begins to eat itself. We cannot afford that. We manufacture truth carefully even for ourselves." He stopped, turned. "There will be a new assignment for you soon. You will continue translating, but your materials will come from Directorate 7, Psychological Operations. You will not sign your name. Do you understand?" "Yes." Zorin paused by the door, hand on the handle. "You did well, Irina Pavlovna. You kept the illusion intact. That is all the party ever asks." Then he left. That evening, she returned to her apartment and sat at her kitchen table until dawn, the city outside dissolving into mist. Her kettle had boiled dry hours earlier. On the wall hung a framed certificate from her university, Excellence in Linguistics. The ink had begun to fade. She thought of Voronin. Had he known he was bait? Had he guessed that his own death was the final punctuation of a sentence written by someone else? In her mind, she saw again the brief moment in the archive when he had said, "They write letters to themselves to prove they're still breathing." Now she understood. Weeks passed. Spring arrived reluctantly. At the Translation Bureau, new assignments arrived under sealed envelopes marked training material. Each contained fabricated Western memoranda, drafts of fake State Department cables, fake intelligence briefings, all written in English, but sprinkled with deliberate anomalies. Her task was to translate them into Russian, maintaining the false syntax so they could be used as teaching tools for counter-espionage officers learning to detect linguistic codes. In truth, the same ciphers she had once exposed were now part of the official doctrine. The weapon she had feared was now state property. One day, she received a training text with a familiar line buried halfway through. "All protocols of mutual agricultural assistance remain confidential." She froze. The words looked harmless, yet her pulse spiked as if she were hearing a ghost. At the bottom of the page was a short signature, printed in faded carbon, S.P.V. Her pen slipped from her hand. For several seconds, she simply stared. The initials could have been coincidence, or something else, a message, a reminder, or a cruel joke embedded by whoever assembled the training files. She never asked. She finished the translation, returned the file, and walked home through a city that had stopped caring who listened. June 1984. Another letter arrived official, this time transfer back to Moscow. The reason? To assist in curriculum design for interagency linguistic standardization. When she entered the capital again after half a year, the city felt smaller, quieter. The ministry tower still loomed over Smolenskaya Square, but its corridors had been repainted, its ghosts replaced with new faces. Her new office was deep underground, no windows, no daylight. Here, language was not a tool of diplomacy, but an instrument of surveillance. The department's purpose? To craft textual environments, documents engineered to elicit specific responses from foreign readers. Every paragraph was a weaponized translation. On her first day, she was handed a folder labeled Operation Glass Harp, Internal Testing of Subliminal Phrasing in English Correspondence. She leafed through the examples and felt a hollow amusement. Phrases like agricultural assistance, peaceful exchange, and mutual cooperation, repeated endlessly, reshaped into new patterns. The code had survived. It simply changed masters. Late one night, while reviewing a sample memo, she noticed another anomaly, not a code this time, but a misprint. The last line of the page read, "The language remembers even when the state forgets." No one had typed that. It wasn't in the original draft. It appeared like a ghost imprint from a reused carbon sheet. She stared at it until the letters blurred. For the first time in years, she felt something close to fear, not of discovery, but of memory itself. The idea that words, once written, never really vanished. They lingered like radiation, invisible yet lethal. Internal Memo Directorate S, July 1984. Subject Morozova, reassigned to Document Engineering Unit, Smolenskaya Square. Clearance restored. Psychological evaluation, stable. Continued service, recommended. Below the summary, in Zorin's handwriting, "She knows the cost of accuracy. She will not err." Months later, he visited her office. He stood by the door, gloved hands behind his back, and asked quietly, "Do you regret what happened?" Irina looked at the stack of translation drafts before her, all identical, all meaningless. "No," she said, "there is nothing left to regret." Zorin nodded, as if that were the correct answer. Then, after a pause, he added, "For the record, Comrade Morozova, there never was a Project Echo." He left before she could reply. After he was gone, she opened her drawer and took out a piece of paper she had kept hidden for months. The original note from the vent, its edges now brittle. Eagle 1-3, extraction delayed. Confirm if contact neutralized. She read it one final time, then placed it back into the drawer. If the project had never existed, she wondered, whose handwriting was it? Outside, Moscow thundered with summer rain. In the ministry basement, water dripped from the ceiling onto the concrete floor, the same slow rhythm she remembered from the archive that night. In another decade, the Soviet Union would dissolve. But in 1984, the machinery of secrecy still turned, grinding even those who kept it alive. Moscow, winter 1985. The snow fell soundlessly, burying the city in a white stillness that felt less like peace than suspension, as if time itself had frozen alongside the streets. In the basement of the ministry, Irina Pavlovna Morozova sat surrounded by silence, the hum of radiators, and the faint metallic tick of a clock that never seemed to move forward. Her title now read Senior Linguistic Engineer. Her work, as defined in bureaucratic terms, was semantic verification for controlled correspondence. In truth, she was no longer translating anything real. She was calibrating lies, designing sentences whose rhythms, lengths, and structures could be used to measure the psychological stability of those who read them. Each word was an instrument, each document a test. When the lights flickered that afternoon, she barely noticed. But when the corridor beyond her office went dark and the sound of footsteps echoed slow and deliberate, she knew, before seeing the silhouette, that the past had returned. Colonel Viktor Zorin stepped inside. He looked older, drawn, his overcoat wet with melted snow. He did not remove his gloves. "There's been an incident," he said. "One of our archive clerks attempted to remove documents related to the Echo files." Irina's throat tightened. "I thought Project Echo didn't exist." Zorin's expression didn't change. "It doesn't. That's the problem. The file was empty, blank paper. Someone wanted to make it real again." He approached the desk, placing a sealed envelope in front of her. "Your signature is on the reclassification form," he said quietly. "Explain that." Irina stared at the envelope. She had not signed anything, but she recognized the typeface on the header, her department's, her own carbon copies. She whispered, "That's not my handwriting." Zorin studied her a moment, then nodded slowly, almost sympathetically. "No, it isn't. But it's close, very close. Enough to convince the archivists. Whoever forged it used your templates, your phrasing, even your punctuation style. Someone is using you, Irina Pavlovna, again." That evening, she walked home through the snow, the envelope still sealed in her bag. Her apartment felt smaller than before, the air stale with cigarette smoke and dust. She laid the document on the table, turned on her desk lamp, and stared at it for a long time before breaking the seal. Inside were photocopies, pages that appeared to be her reports from 1983, each stamped, dated, and initialed in the margins with her signature. But the content was altered. Phrases she had never written now appeared between her lines. Source remains compromised. Coordination with external handlers ongoing. Recommend linguistic isolation to prevent exposure. They were building a new story, one where she, the translator, was not the discoverer of the breach, but its author. She realized, with a calm that terrified her, that this was the final stage of containment. Erase the spy, erase the decoy, and then erase the witness. The next morning, she returned to work early, before anyone else arrived. The building was quiet, its corridors lit by the faint blue of dawn. She used her clearance card to access the archive room. the same concrete chamber where she had once faced Voronin. The shelves stretched endlessly, filled with metal boxes labeled by year and classification. She found the 1983 section, slid out the drawer marked E, 147 to 83, and opened it. Inside were 23 folders, every one of them empty. Only the last contained paper, not reports, but transcript pages from her own interrogations. Questions, answers, pauses, noted in red pencil. At the top of each sheet, stamped diagonally in faded ink, Project Echo, authenticated. She flipped through them in disbelief. Half the statements had been rewritten, adjusted subtly to incriminate. In one line, she was recorded saying, "I recognized the code and responded accordingly." The word responded had been underlined, as if confirming guilt. She realized what Zorin meant by someone wanted to make it real again. Echo had become a ghost that needed flesh, and they were molding her words to fit its body. At 9:17, Zorin entered the room. He did not look surprised to see her. "You went straight to the archive," he said. "Predictable. That helps." Irina closed the folder. "You're rewriting history." Zorin exhaled through his nose. "History rewrites itself. We only provide the grammar." He walked closer, stopping just beyond reach. "You've been useful, loyal, but loyalty creates patterns. Patterns can be forged. Do you see where this goes?" She nodded slowly. To silence. He looked almost impressed. "You understand. Good. Then you'll understand this, too." He placed a small cassette recorder on the table and pressed play. Static filled the room, followed by her own voice, clear and calm. The clause was intentional. Transmission complete. Awaiting confirmation from station. Irina's knees weakened. "That's not me. It's your voice. It's an edit." Zorin tilted his head. "Perhaps. But how many believe in edits when the voice sounds real?" He clicked off the tape and pocketed it. "The committee requires a narrative. The Americans must remain the villains. The state must remain infallible. You, unfortunately, are ideal for the role invisible, believable, disposable." He turned toward the door. This conversation never happened. That night, she didn't go home. She took a tram to the edge of the city, where the industrial blocks gave way to frozen river channels and abandoned depots. There, in a rusted warehouse converted into a storage annex, the ministry kept obsolete typewriters, hundreds of them stacked in rows like relics. She walked between the machines, running her fingers across the cold metal keys. Every letter, every symbol had once carried a message. Now they sat silent, stripped of ribbon and ink. In one corner, she found a functioning machine, still wired to a test circuit. She loaded a blank sheet of paper and began to type slowly, mechanically, without plan. Project Echo was never real, but the people who invented it were. The language learned to speak without us. The clatter of keys echoed in the hollow room like distant gunfire. She pulled the page free, folded it, and slid it into her coat pocket. Then she walked out into the snow. Official report, Directorate K, confidential, February 3rd, 1985. Subject IP, Morozova, failed to report for duty. Apartment found vacant, containing no personal effects. Last confirmed sighting near the Shishikinskaya tram depot, 22:40 hours. Case reclassified. Internal disappearance. Colonel Zorin submitted a closing memorandum 2 days later. Subject likely self-exiled or terminated. Containment successful. All documentation transferred to Vault L3 under sealed classification. Myton Stenas. But in the lower levels of the ministry, weeks afterward, rumors began to circulate. Archivists whispered that someone had retyped the Project Echo file, word for word, in perfect official format, except for one difference. In the final paragraph, beneath the classification stamp, a single, unauthorized line had been added. It read, "Truth remains in translation." No one admitted to seeing it directly. Yet copies appeared, slipped into folders, inserted into unrelated reports, found inside diplomatic briefings and training manuals. The phrase propagated like a virus through the ministry's paperwork. Each department blamed another. When investigators tried to purge it, more copies appeared. Sometimes the words even retyped themselves through carbon sheets on machines that had not been used for days. Zorin received a copy on his own desk one morning, unsigned, smelling faintly of typewriter oil. He read the line twice, then folded the page carefully and locked it in his drawer. Years later, after the Soviet Union fell, an American researcher reviewing declassified KGB archives would find fragments of Project Echo scattered across unrelated collections, security memos, trade files, agricultural reports. The same line repeated again and again in the margins. Truth remains in translation. No one could determine who had written it. Some believed it was Irina's final message. Others claimed it was simply the machine, remembering what people had tried to forget. Internal annotation, Post-Soviet Archive, 1996. Original Project Echo, documents untraceable. Linguistic forensics suggest at least 3 authors. One match, Morozova, I.P. Another partial match, Zorin, V.A. Third, unknown. Possibly automated transcription from mechanical source. The analyst added one final note before the file was reclassified. Perhaps the project's purpose was not communication, but infection. To teach language itself to lie. Moscow, 1999. The archives had changed hands 3 times since the flag above the Kremlin came down. The hammer and sickle were gone, but the files remained tens of thousands of boxes stacked in the basement of what was once the Lubyanka. The corridors smelled of mildew and old glue. Dr. Elena Sokolova, age 31, linguist and researcher at the newly founded Institute for Historical Memory, was one of the few allowed inside. Her project was funded by a Western grant. Computational Traces of State Language Manipulation, 1947, 1991. In practice, it meant sorting through ghosts. Her task that day was simple. Digitize a batch of declassified files marked obsolete linguistic encryption. Most were typewritten memoranda about agricultural aid, trade agreements, and crop quotas. Harmless, bureaucratic, endless. But at 1542, she opened one folder labeled E, 147 to 83, Project Echo. Inside were only 7 sheets of paper. The first 6 were blank, except for faint carbon imprints, like ghosts of text erased long ago. The 7th bore a single sentence, typed in fading Cyrillic, Istina остается в переводе. Truth remains in translation. At the bottom, a signature barely legible, E.P. Morozova. Sokolova frowned. The name meant nothing to her. She scanned the sheet, saved it as a PDF, and fed it through the new translation software her team had been testing. The algorithm, trained on Soviet diplomatic archives, generated the English output automatically. But when the sentence appeared on her monitor, it was different. Truth does not remain in translation. It hides. She blinked. The program had no autonomous editing capability. It was designed only to reproduce literal meaning. She reran the process. Same result. Then again, using a different system identical, every algorithm, every iteration produced a slightly altered sentence, each more human than the last. Truth hides. Truth forgets itself. Truth waits for someone to listen. She stared at the screen until her reflection merged with the words. The office around her was silent, except for the low hum of servers. Outside, Moscow's streets glowed with winter fog, the same dull silver that had hung there 2 decades earlier. Later that evening, she walked down to the archive storage room to double-check the original folder. It was gone. The shelf where E 147 to 83 should have been, was empty. She asked the archivist on duty, an elderly man who had worked there since the 1970s. He shook his head slowly. "That file never existed," he said. "Are you sure?" "Quite sure. Some projects were designed that way, written to disappear." He smiled faintly, as though remembering something private. "Sometimes they even come back." Back in her apartment, Sokolova opened her laptop to recheck the saved file. The PDF was still there, but when she clicked it, the screen flickered and the text rearranged itself before her eyes, one word shifting, one letter changing at a time. "Truth remains in translation. I remain in translation." Then, below it, a line appeared that hadn't existed before. IPM. Her breath caught. She shut the computer, pulled the plug, and sat in the dark, the low hum of the city outside her window blending with the pulse in her ears. In later years, linguists studying early Soviet translation databases would find anomalies in their datasets, recurring fragments of text not traceable to any original source. The fragments shared syntactic DNA with Project Echo's surviving patterns, inverted clauses, misplaced commas, the same deliberate rhythm. When processed through speech synthesis, the fragments produced a voice, female, calm, almost mechanical. A voice saying, in Russian-accented English, "The clause was intentional. Transmission complete." Excerpt, Field Note, Institute for Historical Memory, 2001. The material appears self-replicating. Instances of the echo pattern multiply across unrelated corpora, agricultural, legal, technical. The archive acts as a living linguistic organism. Perhaps the language itself has absorbed what once was coded. Below the note, in smaller handwriting, or perhaps someone is still translating. Life-you, I gay. In 2003, when Sokolova published her first paper on recursive linguistic signatures in Soviet archives, she ended with a single footnote. Case, File E, 147 to 83 references, a translator, female, identity, unverified. No personnel record found. However, analysis of marginalia across multiple ministry texts suggests one consistent typographic fingerprint. Every phrase carries the same linguistic rhythm, precise, restrained, deliberate. Whoever she was, she taught the machine to whisper. As one's conjane. No one ever found Irina Pavlovna Morozova's body. No record of death, no grave, only her initials reappearing like watermarks in old documents and later in machine learning datasets. In 2025, during an AI translation stress test using Cold War data, a sentence emerged that no programmer had written. The file remains open. No glitch report could explain it. No patch could remove it. The engineers deleted the corpus, wiped the drive, and rebuilt the model from scratch. But even in the new system, one phrase returned automatically, unprompted. Truth remains in translation. Archival closing note, compiled by Declassification Committee. The name Morozova appears in no official personnel index, yet the linguistic fingerprints persist across over 4 million documents. Project Echo remains unsourced. Some researchers suggest it was never a code, but a contagion, a syntax infection that rewrote those who studied it. Whatever the case, the record speaks in her absence. And somewhere, between one language and another, her words continue to translate themselves.